Hello, everyone, and welcome to another live webinar between Convito and Sovereignty First. Today on the show, we are having Rob Herndon speak to us about the role of conveners in solving the biggest challenges of our time. So Rob Herndon works for Sovereignty First, and he is a specialist in conflict resolution. And so he's going to be bringing that expertise into the discussion. So this webinar is about being a convener. What specifically to you, Rob, does it mean to be a convener?
Well, great. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much for having me on here. These are really exciting for me. I've enjoyed all of our series of discussions. So today, I really wanted to chat through kind of what we've discovered at Sovereignty First as a way of defining exactly what it is that that we're pushing for. And so we kind of discovered the term convener about 6 months ago. I had gone through a conflict resolution master's program. And ending in 2015, and I hadn't come across the term even then. Mm-hmm. So I feel like it's fairly new. It's a fairly new way of looking at a particular type of role in conflict resolution. So, we learn about negotiations and negotiators, arbitration, facilitation. There's a lot of different roles within conflict resolution, and mm-hmm. What we were working on with Sovereignty First didn't really fit any of those specific defined roles. And so we just randomly thought through some ideas and did a search. And I really want to do a quick shout out to a group called the Collaborative Leaders Network. Okay. They're in Hawaii. And that was the first thing that we came across where it was really, we clicked with a definition of a role. And so they define, and I'm just going to read it, they define a convener as an individual or group responsible for bringing people together to address an issue, problem, or opportunity. And in the context of collaborative leadership, it usually involves convening representatives from multiple sectors for a multiple meeting process, typically on complex issues. And so that's what we really connected with, and we said, conveners, that's who we want to reach out to.
Right. Yes. And so when you talk about conveners in conflict resolution, what's their role?
Great question. So I think a lot of, when we think of convening, we may think of maybe roles within a business, of people who organize meetings, people who bring different parts of their business together, or we may think of, a large central government, maybe the United States government, who has convening power, and they bring together, the UN has a high amount of convening power so that they can bring together multiple nations. Yes. But we don't really think about maybe an individual or an organization that could be focused on convening. And what we think about is a person or organization who wants to work in the background, who doesn't necessarily need all of the credit. And you can think about it a lot like building networks. So being the person in the role of working across different sectors, different cultures, different borders, even different political factions or factions within an organization. So being the person that can work across those different groups and be able to bring them together. So, it could be multiple different meetings. It could be different sessions. It could be, building different trust networks and action networks. But it's people who need to come together in order to solve a complex problem.
Right. So it's a peacemaker, but more than that.
More than that.
Yeah, they are someone who finds the people that need to be at the table
Mm-hmm.
and convenes or brings them together. Is it always into a network, or is it can it be something else other than a network? Is that the goal?
No, that's a great question. I mean, the goal is to build those networks of people who can solve the problem. But no, it's not bringing them into anything specific. A lot of times what we'll find is we start with just open-ended discussions between these groups or individuals or organizations that you've identified that need a seat at the table. And just bringing those people together can start the process of building these networks that then those groups then find commonalities with other groups that they may not even have known existed.
Right.
Or groups that they didn't think they wanted to work with before. Maybe they thought they were, maybe they thought there was a lot of enmity between them, or that they're that they were working against each other. But just by the process of bringing them together into open discussions, they may find, oh, we actually have some common ground on these things. Maybe we can work together on this issue, even if we disagree at the moment on this other thing. And so I guess I would say it really takes a third party to be able to do that, because those groups don't naturally want to come together.
Right.
Even if they may find that they have commonalities at some point. There may be a lot of barriers to cooperating that would take a third party to come in and not necessarily break down. You don't have to break down the barriers. You just, you can identify the groups, keep invitations open to them joining the discussion. And at some point we believe they will want to join in as they see other groups forming coalitions, solving problems, working together. Groups tend to then want to join into something like that because they see that other people are doing something. And so even if they feel not disconnected, but if they feel, even though, these other organizations may not have their same goals, they're going to want to join in because they see things happening.
Right. So, I mean, a convener is someone who is the pre-negotiations person.
Yes.
Right? It's the person who's bringing the people to the table before the negotiations happen. So in like the United Nations or in a mediation conflict resolution situation,
right,
there would be a convener. There would be somebody who is contacting the stakeholders, informing them of the location and the time of the meeting, inviting them to come, finding out who should be at the table. That role is already out there. We just don't really call it that, or we assume that mediators or arbitrators are the ones that do that. Like, what's the?
Yeah, no, I agree, and for me that was what was missing when I was in my conflict resolution program was, we went over mediation and negotiation and arbitration and all of these forms of alternative dispute resolution, and those are all still absolutely necessary. We don't want to pit conveners against these other groups because once people get in the room, you're going to need facilitation, you're going to need mediation, you're going to need negotiation or possibly arbitration. But there is a role for people who need to bring those groups together and get them to the table. And that's what we see as a convener. Right.
So a convener has a really important role to not just bring them to the table, but identify who needs to be at the table.
And it's a huge thing because we all have our own natural biases about who we think are important, who we think needs to be at the table, who needs to have a voice in the negotiations. And those things are natural and they're unavoidable. And so what what we've developed is a set protocol of, okay, how do we go about identifying all of those potential key stakeholders?
Right.
And it could be groups that you may find their behaviors abhorrent. They may be doing horrible things. It could be a logging company that you just think are, outside the bounds of what's legal or ethical. There might be companies or groups of people or organizations that are just doing things that you disagree with, but those people should and they absolutely need to be at the table.
Right.
And so in order to get around those biases, there has to be a set protocol for how to do it. And even if you went out and hired outside experts to identify groups, they have inherent biases.
Right.
And so the only way to get around all the inherent biases is to build in a protocol of how do we go about identifying those key stakeholders?
Yeah, if you're from a municipality, your biases have less of a liability on the project than if you're from the US or Canada and you're going to another country or another society or a small municipality in another country and you're trying to facilitate conflict resolution, then your biases are much more of a liability for that project. I mean, I think that they could probably run on a spectrum, right?
Right. No, absolutely.
So the key is to be the person who is working in the background, bringing people together, finding out who needs to be at the table, and trying to facilitate conversations between those stakeholders in such a way and identify those stakeholders in such a way that you're minimizing as much as possible your biases in the process.
Right.
Can you speak a little bit about how you would do that?
Absolutely. Not to give away everything. But yeah, I mean, it's just a procedure of asking the people on the ground. So you have you have to do your initial research, and accept that in your initial research, you're going to have biases. And so if you do your research on all of the different sectors of a society who need to be included, that could be businesses, government agencies, local investors, local entrepreneurs, nonprofits. So you do your initial research, and then from that list of people that you create, you just call and ask them and set up an interview with them, ask them who they think should be included. But we do have a lot of set protocols based around that, and specific questions that you should be asking to gather specific information. And then we have a way of ranking each of those, what we call prime actors. So there's a whole process to follow to get from your initial research to find out who the actual prime actors are. How do we rank them? And then how do we decide how many of those prime actors should be at the table? And without protocols, without a set system, there could be a lot of potential issues with that.
Biases.
Groups may not want to meet with other groups. But if you're upfront from the beginning of what you're doing, what process you're setting in motion, how many people should be convened. If all of that information is transparent and open from the beginning, what we have found, working in even as contentious of places, Syria, people will identify all of the other prime actors who need to be involved.
So we've talked at length, Conduito and Sovereignty First, in our various discussions about how this process of identifying the role of the convener. There's the organization convener.org, and then there's a collaborative network that you spoke about in Hawaii. These organizations are raising awareness about this term, which is a convener, which is not just a concept, but it's a role, it's a position, it's a career, it's a way to be involved in the negotiation process, conflict resolution process.
Right.
And so we've talked at length about how we see the convener as being sort of a hinge point, or a very important, playing a very important role in building negotiations that look more like future negotiations now.
Right.
And so some of that is in our discussions has been about how to build negotiations that are collaborative.
Right.
What would you say to somebody who said, well, collaborative negotiation seems like a pipe dream? It's very difficult. Like, what do you mean by collaborative negotiations? And then why is that not a pipe dream?
Yeah, great question. We set out to solve complex problems, and that is our goal. And when we say complex problems, we think of things like mass migration, environmental degradation, global warming, all of these issues that seem beyond us. And the reason that we believe in cooperative negotiation, it's necessary. It's just flat out, you have to have cooperative negotiations in order to solve these types of problems. And you have to be able to cooperate even with groups who are benefiting from the current status quo. And it does sometimes feel like a pipe dream. I'm still working through that myself. But it's what we really believe in is that if you follow these protocols, it's not a pipe dream, because with a set process to follow that works, and we've shown that it works in certain places, you can start to build cooperation. And it's not a panacea. It's not magical. There's no, there's no waving of magic wands or
silver bullets.
Right. There's no silver bullets, and this process could take years or generations. We're not trying to hide from that. So it's not an overnight fix. It's not a quick fix. Building cooperation amongst groups takes time. But what we've discovered is that once the process of cooperation starts, it actually builds upon itself.
Yes.
So competition builds upon itself. The more people are competitive, the more everyone else wants to be competitive. We're competing over resources. Once you start the process of cooperation, it's also self-referential. It also builds upon itself. Yes. And so you can start even with just 5 groups or 5 organizations or 5 people. And if you're convening even at that small level, you can start to build cooperation amongst them. Those groups start to get things done. Other people then become interested in it. They're trying to figure out what's going on. Why are these groups now being successful and getting, solutions to some of these problems? They want to join in. All of a sudden now they're cooperating. And that process just spins and grows until all of a sudden you have very powerful groups right now who can see that there's this power that's forming amongst the groups that are cooperating, and now they want to join in and they start to cooperate. So it's building a different system, a different way of doing things. And it can start very small. It can start a little bit larger. It just depends on how many groups you think you can convene at the moment. And it could just be 2 or 3, and it's got to start somewhere. And if you have more power or more finances, and you think you can convene 20 or 30 groups, and you can get people to buy in, that's fantastic. But yeah, it starts small. It starts in a location. It can start as small as you want it to be, and if you build on the right conditions, then once those conditions are in place, the cooperation just builds on itself.
So you've said that the convener is trying to solve. The convener is someone who could be someone addressing a complex problem. That could be like a very complex interlocking problem, like here where I am right now in the fisheries. There's big issues with fishery depletion, right, and common pool resource management issues.
Right.
We have commercial fishers that are really, taking too much fish, and that's the bulk of the problem.
Right.
And so then we have the northern and the southern resident orcas here. Anyway, so that's a kind of a municipal problem that becomes a larger problem, and so
right.
Then you have to bring more people in. But then you could have even a larger issue that would require trans-border kinds of bringing people in across borders, right?
Right.
But then you even have a business that has like a major problem that needs to be resolved, and they need protocols. They need conveners, basically.
Yes.
Like businesses that need conveners.
Right.
So you talk about bringing people across sectors, across borders, across factions, across personalities, right? What's the other thing? Like
cross cultures.
Cross cultures, right? And so those could be cultures within a business.
Yeah.
Those could be cultures within a municipality.
Sure.
Those could be cultures within a watershed issue.
Yeah.
Or those could be like between two warring parties across a transnational border.
Right.
So this is a set of protocols that can go small scale in terms of dealing with company related issues to very, very large scale.
Yes.
And that's why you speak about cross-border and all of that kind of stuff.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, we believe that the protocols that we have developed can work on any level, and it can be incorporated by anyone who wants to work, right, as you say, a very local issue. Right, maybe you live in a fishing town and the fishery is, it's been overfished. So the common pool resources, you say the fish are depleting. And how do we start to resolve that problem? And you may even say, well, isn't that a problem for the government to solve? And I would say that most governments aren't equipped to solve those issues. Even in Western societies, where we see a lot of democracy and a lot of buy-in from groups on the ground, we've built systems to ostensibly deal with these issues. They're even overwhelmed by them.
Right.
How do we bring in all of the groups that need to have a seat at the table? That can be overwhelming for a local municipality. They may not have the resources to do it. But if you, as an activist or an entrepreneur or someone on the ground, wants to get the process started, you can follow these set protocols in order to get that going. And again, it's not going to be solved tomorrow. You're not going to get, these large fishing corporations sitting down at the table with local fishermen and environmental groups and, other local businesses that rely on the fish trade and local government officials. That's not going to happen tomorrow. Right. But you can start the process. And if you keep things going and you're focusing on building inclusion, common understanding, trust, and engagement, if you're focused on building those 4 conditions, you will find that cooperation builds over time. And, if you start today, maybe 2 years down the road, you start to see real improvement and solutions to these problems that you're seeing.
Right. So can you just talk a little bit more about those 4 conditions? Like, obviously, those are the 4 conditions that a convener needs to rely upon to know how to move the stakeholder management process forward. Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by those?
Sure.
Those 4 conditions and why you chose those ones and not anything else?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think when we say the 4 conditions out loud, it sounds pretty obvious. They also sound very aspirational.
It's inclusion.
So we have inclusion.
Building common understanding.
Right.
Building trust between the stakeholders.
Right.
And ensuring full engagement.
Correct. So, right, when we say that out loud, it kind of sounds obvious. Intuitively, we think that that's obvious. Um, how to actually go about building inclusion? How do we build a common understanding of what the problem is? What are other interconnected problems to this problem that we're focusing on? Um,
Mhm.
if we took the fisheries, for example, an entire local economy could be based on these corporations that are out doing mass fishing in the
Yeah,
waters. The entire town could be reliant upon that. So if you disrupt that system, you can disrupt an entire economy.
right.
And is that so? I'm not saying that's positive or negative. I'm just saying you have to think about that. Everyone has to be on the same page about what are the problems that exist.
Right.
What are all of the different potential problems that are, other things, other factors that are addressed or affected by addressing this problem that you're focused on. What are competing threats? If we're talking about a local fishery, obviously global warming could impact that.
Acidification of the oceans.
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of other things that we need to take into account. So you have to get everyone to come to a common understanding of what all those issues are.
Mhm.
Once that happens, once you've figured out all of the people that need to be included, then you've come to a common understanding of what the problem is. Then you can start to build action networks so
Mhm.
people automatically start to engage with each other around, oh, okay, well, that's great. We see some of these problems the same way. Let's work on addressing these things. So those the trust networks that you build lead to action networks to get things done.
Right.
And then you have to make it possible for everyone to engage. So it's not just, have I invited everyone? Are you hosting an event that everyone can attend?
Right.
Are you doing these meetings virtually? Well, what if people don't have access to high-speed internet?
Right.
Or what if you have to include a native group who maybe they don't have equal access to getting into town or getting out to some event center that you're planning a meeting, then you haven't actually included them, even though they've been invited and maybe you've talked with them, maybe you've told them that this is where the meeting's at. If they can't actually get to the meeting, you haven't actually included them. And so those are the four conditions that we believe that people need to focus on to build cooperation, and we have protocols in place to build each of those four conditions.
For sure. And just to put a plug in on that, I mean, you have a course, the inclusion course, which deals with the first condition that needs to be established by someone who is an aspiring convener in order to discover how to include those people.
Right.
That first course is teaching someone how to get started as a convener, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's it. So, we have the first course on inclusion, and then we'll have courses to follow on common understanding, trust, and engagement. And once these protocols have been built out over our founder, Dr. Eric Wolterstorff, his 25 years of experience in the field, working essentially as a convener, although he didn't realize the term existed either. He just did this naturally. But you can take his 25 years of experience and the protocols that he's established, learn them in 8 months to a year, and now you've shortened your window of, you've ramped up your ability to be a convener to solve these problems from 25 years down to 8 months.
Right. Great. So can you explain just a little bit more about why a convener is necessary to solve complex, complicated problems? You've talked a little bit about them bringing people together. Why are they necessary? Why is it that we can't just have someone who's a mediator do the work?
Sure.
Why it has to be the specific person or the set of individuals, holding those positions, taking those roles?
Right. I think that's a great question. I think in the field of conflict resolution, a defined set of roles is being built out. The field of conflict resolution is still relatively new. It's, people have been diplomats and
Mhm.
arbitrators, and they've done these roles, but as a set field, bringing that all together, having delineated roles within that field, I think only really helps to improve the situation. So we're not, if you find your skills to be, I love being in the room and, doing shuttle diplomacy, and, I can facilitate dialogue, and that's what I enjoy doing.
Right.
Maybe you find your passion as a mediator or facilitator,
Right.
or, you really kind of like contentious debates and you like negotiating, and, that's what you find you're passionate about. That's all fantastic. And we're not trying to take away from that, but there has to be a role of people working behind the scenes just to get these groups to the table. And we can't put that work on people who want to be in the room doing this kind of work.
Right.
So yeah, I would say we just want to delineate out, um, you know, the responsibilities of doing conflict resolution. So having someone who works in the background,
Mm.
is potentially different from people who like to work in the room, so to speak.
Right. Right. So, we are now ready to open the floor for Q&A. I'll just put this in here. So our Q&A session is now open. If anyone has a question or a comment they want to make about, complex, complicated, interlocking problems, how how they're thinking about their role. Maybe you are somebody who is a really people person. You like people. You like working with people. You find yourself maybe potentially frustrated by the way that negotiations currently unfold, and you would like to engage in a discussion about what the future of negotiations looks like. Rob and I have talked at length about how negotiations processes are obviously guided by great intentions of people who are involved, and there's a huge field, theory and practice on negotiations, but that there still seems to be attempts to ensure that things are expedient. So the negotiations will unfold in the most expedient way possible, the fastest way possible. The conflict can be resolved, save money, save time, save resources. And sometimes what gets lost in all of that is, effective outcomes for the conflict that people seek to resolve. So anyway, we open the floor to you who are attending. If you would like to ask a question, go ahead and put it on. If no one puts a question, I just want to talk a little bit more about this future of negotiations, Rob, because I'm sure you can agree with me, being someone who's a specialist in conflict resolution and having studied negotiations, that there's so much written about it. There's a huge pool of theory, and there's obviously people across the world in many different industries and fields are doing conflict resolution negotiation work. They're doing it in arbitration between businesses. They're doing an arbitration on local issues. Maybe people don't go to the courts, they go through arbitration. We have negotiations between in many cases between the indigenous communities of our societies and various other interest groups and governments and corporations. So that negotiation process is ongoing. What would you say is some of the biggest stumbling blocks to the way that negotiations are done in 2020, and why do things need to change?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think our model of how to do these types of negotiations is just built on 18th, 19th, and 20th century thinking. We haven't thought through the complexity of an ever-shrinking world. Globalization is bringing us closer together every day. But that actually also makes the problems much more complex because it's not, we're not just dealing with our local community groups anymore. We're not just dealing with, potentially a regional government or a state government. The national government used to be seen as, the big force in our lives, and now that's even expanding to other international governments.
Yes.
When we talk about an issue like global warming, we're talking about, what's happening in Canada is affected by what's happening in China or what's happening in India. So we can't just focus on just localized problems any longer. So that model of negotiation over resources it's far too complex now for any one person or group or government to deal with. There are too many factors. There's too many interconnected variables, too many issues.
Right.
It's impossible. It's not that people aren't trying. It's not that there aren't good intentions. There's a lot of people trying to work on these issues. It's just too complex for any one group to do. And that's why you have to identify all of the groups who should be involved, and just open communication and dialogue with them. And that can be sometimes the hardest thing, actually, start that process.
So why is climate change negotiations in the United Nations, why is that not enough? Why can't that be enough to solve the problem of climate change?
Yeah, that's another great question. I would say this is a personal opinion. I think it's backed up by some data. But the way that the UN is set up currently, with the 5 nations who have veto power, any advancement that the UN wants to make on climate change has to be approved by the 5 nations who are the most industrialized. And so anything that's going to affect, the United States or affect China or affect Russia, anything that's going to directly impact those economies, they're going to veto in the United Nations. There's no way around that at the moment. And so it's going to take starting more local. It's going to take, groups on the ground in, places like Borneo, a place that we've referenced, places like India, Brazil, places in the global south, who don't currently have power within the UN to make the kinds of treaties and negotiations. There has to be another way to build cooperation, between different groups, and it could be across borders. You may not be able to start those types of negotiations across borders immediately, but we have to start building those processes of cooperation on the ground in localized places, and then they build and build and build, and if we do that in enough localized places, then it starts to form together. So I think we have 2 questions that we skipped over.
Yeah, so quickly, Hiraz Mansour says, can you give a quick highlight of the main points or steps to follow that apply to just about any multi-party process? And so we talked about the 4 conditions, right? That you need to have, you need to have people convened in order to bring multiple stakeholders together.
Yeah.
Right? You need to go through a series of 4 steps.
Right.
One of those steps is ensuring, I'll let you go.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to jump in there. But yeah, main points. Great question. So identify the key stakeholders. Who are they?
Yes.
Build a common understanding of the problem.
Yes, and the protocols.
Yep. So there's protocols to follow. So now that we have included all of the people that need to be included, we have a common understanding of the problem. We can build trust networks build trust amongst all of those stakeholders, and there's protocols to keep everybody engaged in the process.
Yes.
And so if you follow those 4 things, the protocols for those 4 conditions, you build cooperation over time to solve the complex problems.
Yeah, and Firas has asked about that question in a workspace, and that applies to a workspace. You find you have an issue in a some sort of work environment, and you have to convene the people that have to, that could make or break the agreement.
Right.
You have to bring them together, make sure they're included.
Right.
Inviting them to the meeting.
Right.
You have to, help them to understand the common reference points. What is the, what needs to be.
Right.
Where is everybody on this issue, on this set of issues? Get an understanding of where everyone stands.
Right.
And then once you have an idea of where everyone stands, and you have you've agreed on the protocols for the meeting, then you start to build trust between those people.
Right.
Right. Even if they're people who've worked together for decades, you still have to find out what are the hangups. People have personality issues, right? People have old grievances, and you need to kind of hash those out before you can move forward if the issue is especially existential for the workspace, right?
Right. Absolutely.
And then, full engagement. And full engagement for you at Sovereignty First means that people have the right to enter the discussions and also lead the discussions voluntarily.
Right. Everything is about voluntary. Thank you for that question, especially the multi-party process. Right. The most important thing to solving complex problems is that everyone has to voluntarily include themselves. So the whole process has to be voluntary. No one can be forced into an agreement. No one should be excluded just because they can't access the negotiations. So you have an ease of access to negotiations, and then everyone has the right to opt in or out of, even if you've come to an agreement. Things change. Situations change. What worked for someone a year ago may not work for them now. So there has to be a right of people to then exit that agreement if it's no longer working for them. And we may have to come back to the table and, renegotiate or rediscuss different parts of an agreement. So. For
sure.
Yeah.
Sorry, I put Yangbo's question up too soon.
Oh, no, that's okay.
Okay, so Yangbo is asking, how might a convener best encourage parties to tame their egos in terms of coalition building? The challenge is shifting mindsets from a great power or extractive mindset to collective security integrative.
That's a great question.
Of course it is.
Yeah, that is a great question. I would say you're probably not going to get a lot of groups to overcome their egos. I think what you have to do is build a process that has enough power so that people feel the need to include themselves. So you have to speak to every person is going to have their own interests in whether or not they involve themselves. And sometimes you're just not going to be able to overcome egos or convince someone that their ego is getting in the way. So you have to create the situation where the people you have convened, the group that you have brought together, has enough power that then these groups see it in their self-interest that they have to include themselves. Because if they don't include themselves, they could lose their power.
Well, and especially with extractive resources, because extractive resources often have a moment of finite time, meaning that people's interests in those finite resources, may be sort of short-term vision, just looking at, getting as much out of the ground as possible in a short amount of time because it'll expand profits.
Right.
But, they have an interest too in having that, they have a skill set and they have the machinery and they have the people to extract that resource. And if they extract it just as fast as they possibly can, which many a corporation has learned over the last 150 years, then eventually you're going to reach a point where you extracted everything and there's nothing left.
Sure.
So their livelihoods are tied to sustainability.
They are. And you know, a company, a business, their entire MO is to stay in business. And I think we have seen that as a negative. It's come to be seen as a negative. And I don't think we should allow ourselves to see it that way, because they are an economic generator. They supply jobs. An economy is a needed thing. And businesses, they have to look out for themselves. They have to remain in business to keep people employed. And if they're not keeping people employed, then they cease to be useful. So if we're talking about those types of corporations or organizations, they have to be included. There's no way around it. Because if you come to an agreement and you didn't include them, they could very easily sabotage that agreement. So we have to recognize that they have power. We have to accept that they have power, and we have to accept that the entire reason for their existence is this thing that they're doing. And we may find their behavior abhorrent. They may be exploiting people in the location that they've begun to mine, or they're drilling for resources. We may find all of that behavior abhorrent, but we have to include them. They have to be part of the discussions.
Yeah. So the first part of Yang Bo's question was, how do we tame their egos? And I think what you're saying is that you tame their egos by including them, hearing their points of view, building influence and charisma with them, and trying to reach a common understanding about what is the meaning of sustainability. Because it is true that governments want to make a profit, but we don't necessarily have to assume that capitalism has to be rabid. We don't have to necessarily assume that corporations are not able to think like human beings. They're just robotic. They are out for the bottom line, no matter what, boom or bust. It doesn't matter. We want as much money as we possibly can. We want as much prestige and power as we possibly can.
Well, if I can jump in there for a second.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, you're fine. No, I had a thought. I mean, the business model itself is built to be adaptable. So businesses have to adapt to an environment. And so if an environment changes, that business has to adapt with it, or that business is going to go out of business. So if you've included this corporation from the very beginning and you've been transparent about what you're doing, they may not include themselves from the beginning because they may see you as a threat. But if you've then built up enough power amongst enough groups that the environment in which that company is working in changes, that company is going to have to adapt to that change. So it then becomes their self-interest to become part of the work that you're doing. And you will find that they will include themselves because they have to.
Right. I mean, collective security traditionally, and especially in the 20th century, really emerged from crisis. It really emerged from a recognition that atomized, individualized self-interest at the state level or whatever can leave people vulnerable. So if corporations are impressed with the idea that corporations or whomever is in an extractive kind of mentality, or sort of impressed with the idea that are, encouraged to think about the idea that, their long-term stability and security as a corporation, as an entity that seeks to maintain its profits,
Mm-hmm.
is only going to be maintained through collaboration.
Right.
In the long term.
Right.
Then perhaps we can get people thinking past their egos and their own self-interest.
I would agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that is how in the state system, how collective security emerged. It emerged especially after World War I.
Mm-hmm.
We had the League of Nations. We had this idea that, we had to come together as a body of states,
right,
try and ensure that we don't have another war.
Right.
And then we had another war.
And then we had another war.
And then yes. And so from these wars, we've realized, and then NATO emerged, the Warsaw Pact emerged as a form of collective security, realizing that, people's ideas that they can survive on their own, they're not realistic. I have camped in the wilderness, and as soon as I start camping in the wilderness, I realize, wow, I really need the people who supply my water, and I really need the people who supply my sanitation,
right.
and I really need the people who supply my food.
Right.
Like, not until we're put in these austere conditions that we realize we need each other, right?
Right. Right. And that our system is built. It's built on something. We've built, as you said, these systems of potential cooperation amongst different groups, different stakeholders, different nations, even. And so we've attempted to build these collaborative or cooperative networks. I would just say that the foundation, the ideas that we're trying to build those cooperative networks with are outdated.
Oh, absolutely.
And so we have to
the situation.
right. And so we have to change the process of how that's done. We believe that this is the beginning of changing that process.
For sure. So thank you, Yangbo. I hope that gets in the direction of answering your question. Firaz says, thank you. How does one handle or identify hidden or not so hidden parties or special interest groups that are invested or seemingly invested in the process failing? Great. So how do you handle those people who maybe they seek to
Sure. That's a great question. Yeah, because there are groups that benefit from the current situation. And they may be, if I'm reading the question correctly, they may be invested in making your process fail because they see it as a threat. And there are absolutely groups that you have no idea that exist that are out there doing work that, work in this space. So the best thing that you can do, I'm very sorry. Hold on one second. There we go. You have to, the process is to actually ask the groups that you've identified that should be included. You need to ask them who they think should be included. And you're going to discover all sorts of groups that you had no idea about. You're going to discover groups that you didn't think should be included, but other people identify them as groups that should be included. And so the whole process of reaching out and asking shows you all of your potential biases or shows you just places where you have a blind spot, and just accepting that those exist. We all have them. It's not
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Even other people, even those corporations that seem self-interested, they are operating with their own echo chamber. So you could have the commercial fisheries, those corporations that are out there pulling tons of fish out of the water. They themselves operate in their own little ecosystem, and they potentially are out on the water like most of the year. And then when they're not out on the water, they're with their own groups talking about the same things.
Right.
So the second you bring them off their boats, so to speak, and you bring them into the conversation, you help them to sort of see a different perspective, you're opening them up
Yeah.
to getting beyond their own echo chamber, to you're being a sounding board for them
Right.
to see the situation differently.
Yeah.
And if you never took that action, they never would.
No, they're not
Right.
going to. Right. Yeah. I mean, if this was easy, if it happened naturally, it would happen. So, it's something that we have to work at. And sometimes that takes a third party, what we call a convener, to get that process going.
Yeah, so Yangbo is saying, so quite satisfactory indeed. So he's feeling that the the response is helping to give him some more insights. Aim here is to take what worked well with the NATO, EU, and UN and build upon those things to reflect 21st century realities. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Like we have to see how is power distributed in the 21st century and operate
right
with that reality.
Right.
We're not operating in 1944, 1945 anymore.
No.
And in fact, those people those countries that have veto power, we're kind of in a stupor that those entities now hold such power.
Right.
And so that worked for 1945, but now in this day and age, we're seeing corporations,
right,
individuals.
Yeah. Multinational corporations are,
and Melinda Gates Foundation as two individuals with a foundation, their power is enormous.
Right.
So these people, these groups, these corporations, these interest groups are wielding considerable power in the 21st century, in the reality now.
Right.
Why don't we operate and build negotiations processes with this existing reality rather than seeing, well, we have to go to the UN because the UN is the UN.
Right.
I'm happy for the UN. I love the UN. I'm glad we have the UN, but
Yeah, no, exactly. What has worked for the EU, what has worked for the UN, it may not work in other places. It may not work in the global South. It may not work for a lot of countries in Asia. Besides China, it may not work for countries in Southeast Asia. So, right, there's systems that have been built, and those systems function for their time period, but we always have to do systematic change.
Yes,
reevaluate, distribute power in ways that, when the UN was created, it did distribute power, and it was effective at doing that for a time, and there are ways that it is still functional today, but we need to supplement that kind of work. We can't just rely on the old institutions to do it. So we have to distribute the governance, the ability to govern.
We have to follow the direction that power lies. Is basically what we need to do.
Right.
Because otherwise, we're lying to ourselves about certain entities having to be the ones to guide the negotiations process and solve the problems.
Right.
Then by doing that, we're abdicating our responsibility, which is to follow the trail where the power lies in order to bring the power holders to the conversation.
Right.
And they may not necessarily come to the conversation in the traditional methods. Right.
Yeah. Right. Well, and a lot of people are excluded from the current system. So if we're not talking to them, if we're not engaging people in a location that we need to solve a piece of global warming in a place that's been typically excluded from these kinds of negotiations, and we're just coming in as outsiders and telling people, okay, you need to change this and this and this in order to positively affect global warming. Why would those people listen? They didn't have any stake in the process of a solution. So if they didn't have a stake in designing the solution or being a part of the initial discussions or negotiations, why are they going to be excited or involve themselves in the potential solution?
They're not.
There's nothing in it for them.
Human nature.
Right. It is human nature. And so we have to work around all of the potential things that we know are in our human nature, that we are self-interested. And so how can we build a system that takes that into account?
Right.
And I think we're at an hour.
We are. One more question from Firas, and then we're going to wrap this up. Are there groups that should flat out be excluded till you build momentum?
No. No. From the very, so the only barrier should be your own ability to convene groups. So whatever ability you have, and as long as you're transparent from the very beginning, if you tell everyone that you're interviewing during the inclusion process, if you're telling them and being transparent of saying, listen, I'm trying to identify all of the groups needed, but I can only convene 10 of those groups, and you're telling people from the very beginning, you just take the top 10 of whoever decide, however that list comes about, and you rank people. If you've said 10, you need to convene 10. You can't make it 9, you can't make it 11, you can't build out a list and have told people 10 and then you invite 20. So, it just depends on your ability to convene groups, but you should never automatically exclude anyone from the beginning. And that could potentially include terrorist groups.
Yeah. So Rob, Yangbo says, my impression is that groups such as C40 Cities and Global Resilient Cities Network might be pointing the way forward.
That's great. I'm actually not super familiar with each of those, but I would love to be.
They sound like distributed governance networks. They really sound like, that's what it sounds like.
It does sound that way.
Like localized governance systems.
Right. So I think any process that begins to build cooperation, and if these groups are doing that and finding ways to include people, all key stakeholders, then I think that is certainly the way forward. We have to build localized governance structures that are outside of our current understanding of government.
Yes, honestly, this would be a great topic for another live webinar talking about distributive governance networks. I mean, I just find the idea fascinating. Yeah. I love it. I really think that it is speaking to the reality that is existing now.
Yeah.
And I'm super excited by the concept because I really truly believe that this is the thing that we need in order to move governance forward. So Faraz Mansour says, okay, great, thank you. And Yangbo says, localized and globally connected at once. Yes.
Perfect, that's exactly it.
Distributed governance networks. You have those localized networks building local empowerment capacities in those locales, and you have all of these different groups doing that, and then you have a global phenomenon in your hands.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, that's exactly it.
So, Rob, I think we'll probably end there. We're past 1 hour. And thank you, Yangbo. Thank you, Firas. Thank you for everyone who's been attending this convener discussion. We're super excited about the topic, about the concept, and about, connecting with people and building community around these concepts, building community around the idea of building distributed governance networks, and using conveners to do that. That's right. Thank you, Rob, and we'll see everyone soon.
Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Okay, bye, everyone.